On a crowded bus, a cruel act shattered the quiet atmosphere. A racist man, filled with arrogance and hatred, suddenly attacked an elderly black woman. But what he didn't know was that fate had placed his rage in the wrong place. Sitting right next to her was her grandson, a Navy SEAL, silently witnessing everything. What happened next wasn't just a harsh lesson for the aggressor, but also a reminder that justice sometimes emerges from the most unexpected places. The early morning sun cast a warm glow over the bustling city streets, where the daily rhythm of life played out in a familiar melody. James Walker, a retired Navy SEAL, boarded the crowded city bus with his 94-year-old grandmother, Mrs. Abigail Walker. Despite her age, Abigail's eyes still sparkled with the wisdom and resilience of a life well lived, while her grandson's broad shoulders and stern demeanor spoke of years of discipline and courage. James had chosen public transportation that day to spend quality time with his grandmother and to remind her of the city's vibrancy beyond their quiet suburban home. Abigail, clutching her small handbag, smiled up at her grandson, unaware of the challenges this day would bring. The bus's atmosphere was a mixture of routine and chaos, students chattering, office workers absorbed in their phones, and an elderly woman struggling with her shopping bags. James and Abigail found seats near the middle, where they settled in for the ride. The vehicle jerked forward, and James instinctively steadied his grandmother with a firm hand on her shoulder. As the cityscape rolled by, James began explaining the importance of respect and resilience to Abigail, weaving life lessons into their brief journey. The tranquility of their ride was disrupted when a man stumbled onto the bus at the next stop. He was middle-aged, disheveled, and reeking of alcohol. His loud, slurred voice filled the bus as he struggled to keep his balance. He scanned the seats with an air of entitlement before collapsing heavily into the spot beside James, his bottle clinking ominously against the metal railing. The tension in the air was palpable as passengers exchanged uneasy glances. James remained calm but alert, his instincts honed from years in service. The man's behavior grew increasingly obnoxious as he muttered curses under his breath and leered at other passengers. Abigail, ever observant, looked to her grandson with a mixture of curiosity and concern. James reassured her with a subtle nod, but his eyes stayed fixed on the man, calculating every possible outcome. The bus, a microcosm of the city's diversity, continued its journey, unaware that the harmony of this shared space was on the verge of shattering. The bus continued its bumpy journey through the city, and the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing moment. The drunk man, whose name no one knew but whose presence was impossible to ignore, began to mutter loudly. His words, incoherent at first, soon took on a darker tone as his gaze lingered on Abigail. The elderly woman, seated next to the window, tried to focus on the passing scenery, but her discomfort was evident. James, sitting between his grandmother and the unruly passenger, kept his composure, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. "Look at this old hag," the man sneered, his slurred words carrying through the bus. "What's a woman like this doing here? Probably up to no good." His voice was laced with venom, and though his speech was unsteady, his intent was clear. A few passengers turned their heads, but most avoided eye contact, unwilling to involve themselves. James felt a slow burn ignite within him, but he maintained his silence, his military training demanding restraint. The man's taunts escalated, his words becoming more targeted and offensive. "Bet your grandson taught you to think you're better than everyone else." "Huh," he spat, glaring at Abigail. The elderly woman glanced at her grandson, her small hands clutching the edges of her seat. James placed a calming hand on his grandmother's shoulder, silently communicating strength and protection. Inside, however, his thoughts raced. Years of discipline battled with a grandson's instinct to protect his loved one at any cost. The tension reached its breaking point when the man abruptly leaned over James, his alcohol-laden breath invading their space. Without warning, he aimed a crude comment directly at Abigail, followed by an aggressive shove to the elderly woman's arm. It wasn't hard enough to cause injury, but it was enough to ignite James's protective instincts, but it was enough to jolt the entire bus. Abigail gasped, her eyes wide with shock. James rose slightly in his seat, his towering frame casting a shadow over the man. "Enough," he said, his voice low and commanding, yet filled with a quiet fury that demanded respect. The drunkard hesitated for a moment, but the alcohol-fueled bravado quickly returned, setting the stage for an inevitable clash. The tension in the air was palpable as the bus jostled forward, its passengers frozen in a mix of fear and anticipation. The drunk man, emboldened by the alcohol coursing through his veins, leaned back in his seat and laughed mockingly. "What's the matter? Tough guy? Think you're going to scare me?" His voice slurred but carried a venomous edge, and his gaze fixed on James with a mix of defiance and contempt. Abigail pressed closer to her grandson, her small hand clutching James's sleeve as though drawing strength from him. James, still seated but now fully alert, kept his expression stoic, his eyes locked onto the man with an intensity that only those trained in combat could muster. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to spring into action if the man's aggression escalated. Yet James held his ground, silently weighing his options. This was no battlefield, but his instinct to protect his grandmother was just as powerful as any mission he'd ever undertaken. Then it happened. With no warning, the man's fist shot out, catching Abigail on the side of her face. The impact was sharp and sudden, sending the elderly woman tumbling into James's lap. A collective gasp rippled through the bus, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Abigail clutched her cheek, tears welling in her eyes as she looked up at her grandson, bewildered and frightened. The drunk man smirked, satisfied with his outburst, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed. James rose to his full height, towering over the man with an air of authority that silenced the entire bus. His voice was low and measured, yet each word carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The drunk man, momentarily taken aback, tried to laugh it off, but the steel in James's gaze erased any semblance of confidence. The passengers, sensing a shift in power, began murmuring among themselves, their initial fear now replaced with curiosity about how the situation would unfold. The bus's wheels screeched as it came to a sudden stop, jolting the passengers forward. Yet no one dared move or speak. All eyes were fixed on James, whose towering frame and unwavering composure exuded a quiet yet palpable authority. He bent down, gently pulling Abigail into his arms and inspecting the reddened mark on her cheek. "You're okay, Grandma," James murmured, his voice softer now, reassuring Abigail despite the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. The drunk man, momentarily disarmed by James's sheer presence, attempted to mask his fear with bravado. "What? You going to hit me now, big man? Huh?" he sneered, though his voice wavered. James didn't respond. Instead, he straightened, his piercing gaze locking onto the man. The quiet in his stance was far more intimidating than any raised voice could have been. The bus driver, unsure whether to intervene, glanced nervously in the rearview mirror while other passengers whispered anxiously among themselves. "Stand up," James finally said, his voice as steady as a drumbeat. It wasn't a request, it was a command. The man hesitated, his bravado crumbling under the weight of James's authority. "I said, stand up." This time, the words were accompanied by a step forward, and the drunk man scrambled to his feet, stumbling slightly as he did. "You think you can put your hands on an elderly woman and walk away?" James asked, his tone sharp enough to slice through the thick tension in the air. As the bus passengers watched in stunned silence, James leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was nonetheless audible to all. "You picked the wrong grandson and the wrong grandmother." The man's eyes darted nervously around the bus, searching for an ally among the onlookers, but found only cold, disapproving stares. James's calm restraint made every word he spoke carry the weight of a verdict, and in that moment, it became clear this confrontation was far from over. The bus remained eerily silent as James stared down the drunk man. Every passenger could feel the weight of the moment, the air thick with anticipation. James, still calm and composed, made no sudden moves. Instead, he addressed the crowd, "This isn't just about my grandmother," he said, his voice carrying a calm authority. "It's about everyone who's ever had to face hate and ignorance. And today it ends right here." The drunk man, now visibly shaken, tried to muster a laugh. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," he muttered, his bravado replaced by a thin veneer of fear. But James wasn't done. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the man's. "You put your hands on an elderly woman," he said, his voice steady but firm. "What kind of man does that? A coward. That's who. And cowards don't get to walk away unchallenged." The drunk man stammered, his words slurred and incoherent. But James interrupted him with the precision of a man trained to take control. "Sit down," he commanded, pointing to the seat. The man, too overwhelmed to argue, dropped back into his seat with a thud. Turning to Abigail, James knelt and placed a reassuring hand on his grandmother's shoulder. "You're strong, Grandma," he said, "and no one gets to make you feel small. Remember that." The other passengers began to murmur among themselves, their fear giving way to admiration for James's strength and composure. A young woman in the back finally spoke up, her voice trembling but clear. "Thank you," she said, her words echoing what many on the bus felt. James nodded slightly in acknowledgement, his focus now on ensuring Abigail was safe, and the man understood the gravity of his actions. This wasn't just about a single act of violence. It was a lesson that would echo far beyond the confines of the bus. As the bus rolled forward, the tension in the air began to shift. James returned to his seat, pulling Abigail close to him, his arm protectively wrapped around her shoulders. The drunk man slouched in his seat, subdued but still muttering under his breath. The other passengers, emboldened by James's calm authority, began to speak up. A middle-aged man near the front turned in his seat, his voice clear and steady. "You owe that woman an apology," he said firmly. The drunk man's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes darting toward the source of the voice. "Mind your own business," he slurred, but his tone lacked the venom it had earlier. Another passenger chimed in, a young woman with a baby on her lap. "He's right. You can't just hit an elderly woman and expect us to stay silent." The bus driver glanced in the rearview mirror, visibly relieved that James's actions had inspired the passengers to speak out. James leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the drunk man's. "You see what's happening here?" he asked, his voice calm yet piercing. "People are standing up to you because they know what you did was wrong. This isn't about me or even my grandmother. This is about showing people like you that your hate has no place here." His words were measured, each one striking like a hammer. The drunk man shifted uncomfortably, his bravado crumbling further under the weight of the collective judgment. Abigail, who had been quietly observing the scene, finally spoke up, her voice small but resolute. "Why are you so mean?" she asked, looking directly at the man. The question hung in the air, simple yet profound. The drunk man opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. The bus fell silent again, the only sound the hum of the engine. James gave his grandmother a proud smile, his chest swelling with pride at Abigail's courage. In that moment, it was clear the drunk man was not only facing a Navy SEAL, but also the strength of a united community, but found only cold, disapproving stares. James's calm restraint made every word he spoke carry the weight of a verdict. And in that moment, it became clear this confrontation was far from over. The bus remained eerily silent as James stared down the drunk man. Every passenger could feel the weight of the moment, the air thick with anticipation. James, still calm and composed, made no sudden moves. Instead, he addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about my grandmother," he said, his voice carrying a calm authority. "It's about everyone who's ever had to face hate and ignorance. And today it ends right here." The drunk man, now visibly shaken, tried to muster a laugh. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," he muttered, his bravado replaced by a thin veneer of fear. But James wasn't done. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the man's. "You put your hands on an elderly woman," he said, his voice steady but firm. "What kind of man does that? A coward. That's who. And cowards don't get to walk away unchallenged." The drunk man stammered, his words slurred and incoherent. But James interrupted him with the precision of a man trained to take control. "Sit down," he commanded, pointing to the seat. The man, too overwhelmed to argue, dropped back into his seat with a thud. Turning to Abigail, James knelt and placed a reassuring hand on his grandmother's shoulder. "You're strong, Grandma," he said, "and no one gets to make you feel small. Remember that." The other passengers began to murmur among themselves, their fear giving way to admiration for James's strength and composure. A young woman in the back finally spoke up, her voice trembling but clear. "Thank you," she said, her words echoing what many on the bus felt. James nodded slightly in acknowledgement, his focus now on ensuring Abigail was safe, and the man understood the gravity of his actions. This wasn't just about a single act of violence. It was a lesson that would echo far beyond the confines of the bus. As the bus rolled forward, the tension in the air began to shift. James returned to his seat, pulling Abigail close to him, his arm protectively wrapped around her shoulders. The drunk man slouched in his seat, subdued but still muttering under his breath. The other passengers, emboldened by James's calm authority, began to speak up. A middle-aged man near the front turned in his seat, his voice clear and steady. "You owe that woman an apology," he said firmly. The drunk man's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes darting toward the source of the voice. "Mind your own business," he slurred, but his tone lacked the venom it had earlier. Another passenger chimed in, a young woman with a baby on her lap. "He's right. You can't just hit an elderly woman and expect us to stay silent." The bus driver glanced in the rearview mirror, visibly relieved that James's actions had inspired the passengers to speak out. James leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the drunk man's. "You see what's happening here?" he asked, his voice calm yet piercing. "People are standing up to you because they know what you did was wrong. This isn't about me or even my grandmother. This is about showing people like you that your hate has no place here." His words were measured, each one striking like a hammer. The drunk man shifted uncomfortably, his bravado crumbling further under the weight of the collective judgment. Abigail, who had been quietly observing the scene, finally spoke up, her voice small but resolute. "Why are you so mean?" she asked, looking directly at the man. The question hung in the air, simple yet profound. The drunk man opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. The bus fell silent again, the only sound the hum of the engine. James gave his grandmother a proud smile, his chest swelling with pride at Abigail's courage. In that moment, it was clear the drunk man was not only facing a Navy SEAL, but also the unwavering strength of a united community. The bus continued its journey through the city, but the tension inside refused to dissipate. James remained seated beside Abigail, his calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions raging beneath the surface. Across the aisle, the drunk man fidgeted, his confidence eroded by the collective disapproval of the passengers. Yet in his intoxicated state, shame quickly gave way to defiance. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he sneered, his words aimed at James, but lacking the venom they once carried. James met the man's gaze with unflinching steadiness. "This isn't about being better," he replied. "It's about being decent, something you seem to have forgotten." The man bristled at the words, his fists clenching as though preparing for another outburst. James noticed the subtle movement, but didn't flinch. Years of training had taught him to recognize the signs of an impending fight, and he was ready if it came to that. The passengers, emboldened by James's quiet strength, began to rally around him. An older woman, sitting near the front, stood up, her voice firm and unwavering. "I've ridden this bus for years, and I've seen people like you cause trouble for no reason," she said, pointing at the drunk man. "But today, we're not staying silent." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement, the collective resolve of the group growing stronger. The drunk man's bravado faltered further, his eyes darting nervously around the bus. Abigail, still cradled under her grandson's arm, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why is he so angry?" James looked down at his grandmother, his expression softening. "Some people don't know how to deal with their own pain, so they hurt others instead," he explained quietly. But that doesn't make it right. Abigail nodded solemnly, her small hands clutching her grandson's sleeve for comfort. James turned back to the drunk man, his voice calm but firm. You have a choice right now, he said. You can keep digging yourself deeper, or you can start making things right. The drunk man slumped further into his seat, visibly shaken by the mounting pressure from both James and the other passengers. His defiance seemed to waver, his bravado now a fragile facade. For a fleeting moment, a hint of vulnerability crossed his face, as if the weight of his actions had finally begun to sink in. Yet his response was hesitant and defensive. You don't know me, he muttered, his voice quieter now. You don't know what I've been through. James leaned forward slightly, his expression softening but his tone firm. You're right. I don't know your story, he said, but that doesn't give you the right to hurt others, especially an elderly woman. His words hung in the air, a blend of compassion and accountability. The other passengers, who had been vocal moments before, now listened in silence, captivated by the gravity of the exchange. Abigail, still nestled against her grandson, looked up with a mixture of curiosity and understanding. It's not too late to say sorry, she said softly, her voice filled with a sincerity that pierced through the tension. The drunk man flinched at her words, his eyes briefly meeting Abigail's before darting away. Something in her innocence seemed to disarm him, stripping away the layers of bitterness and anger he had carried with him onto the bus. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the engine and the muffled sounds of the city outside. Finally, the drunk man let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping as if a great weight had been lifted. I didn't mean for things to get like this, he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. I've been going through some stuff. His admission, though hesitant, felt genuine, and the atmosphere on the bus shifted once again. James nodded, recognizing the man's vulnerability as a step toward change. We all have struggles, he said, but it's how we deal with them that defines us. James said, gesturing toward Abigail, you owe my grandmother an apology, not because it'll fix everything, but because it's the right thing to do. The drunk man hesitated, then turned to Abigail, his voice trembling. I'm sorry, ma'am. I shouldn't have done that. Abigail looked up at her grandson, who gave her an encouraging nod. It's okay, Abigail said simply, her words carrying the kind of forgiveness only a wise elder could offer. The drunk man's apology hung in the air, fragile yet sincere. The passengers exchanged glances, many of them visibly moved by the shift in the atmosphere. James, ever composed, placed a reassuring hand on Abigail's shoulder. You did the right thing by forgiving him. Grandma, he said softly, sometimes forgiveness is as powerful as standing up for yourself. Abigail nodded, her frame seeming to carry a newfound understanding of strength and compassion. The drunk man sat silently, his head bowed as if weighed down by his own reflection. The tension in his body slowly eased, and his gaze shifted to the elderly woman he had hurt. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice steadier now. Not just to you, he added, gesturing toward Abigail, but to everyone here. I've been carrying a lot of anger, and it's no excuse for what I did. His words, though hesitant, carried an air of sincerity that resonated with the other passengers. An older man seated nearby spoke up, his voice calm but firm. We all make mistakes, he said, but it takes courage to own up to them. Maybe this is your chance to start fresh. The drunk man nodded slowly, his rough demeanor softening as he absorbed the words. For the first time since boarding the bus, he appeared vulnerable, as though the layers of anger and resentment that had defined him were beginning to peel away. As the bus neared its next stop, the driver glanced in the rearview mirror and spoke up for the first time. This is your stop, he said, addressing the drunk man. The man stood, swaying slightly as he steadied himself on the handrail. He turned to James and Abigail one last time. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll try to do better. James nodded, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with quiet resolve. As the man stepped off the bus, the tension that had gripped the passengers finally began to dissipate, leaving behind an air of reflection and hope. As the bus doors closed behind the drunk man, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the passengers. The tension that had gripped them moments ago was now replaced by a sense of calm, tinged with a subtle air of reflection. James adjusted Abigail's seatbelt, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "You okay, Grandma?" he asked softly. Abigail nodded, her eyes still wide but now filled with a quiet confidence. "I'm okay, James," she replied. "You didn't let him scare me." Around them, the atmosphere began to lighten. A young woman smiled at Abigail and said, "You're a brave lady. You handled that really well." Abigail glanced up at James, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. "Thank you," she said shyly, her cheeks flushing. The other passengers began to chime in, sharing words of support for the elderly woman and admiration for James's calm but firm handling of the situation. One of the passengers, an older man with a kind face, leaned toward James. "I've seen a lot in my years," he said, "but the way you handled that, it gave all of us a lesson in patience and strength." James, ever modest, shrugged slightly. "Sometimes you just have to meet anger with discipline and fear with resolve," he said. "But protecting my grandmother, that's instinct." The bus rolled on, the earlier conflict now a memory that lingered only in the lessons it left behind. Abigail, feeling the eyes of the passengers on her, leaned close to her grandson. "James," she whispered, "do you think he'll really change?" James paused, considering his grandmother's question carefully. "I hope so," he said at last. "But what matters most is that we did our part. We stood up for what's right and showed him there's a better way." Abigail nodded, her small hands clutching her grandson's sleeve for comfort. James's heart swelled with pride and love for his grandmother, knowing that they had made a difference that day, not just for themselves but for everyone on that bus, and clutching his grandmother's arm. Together they sat quietly, the hum of the bus carrying them toward home and the promise of a better tomorrow. The bus continued its journey, the sun now casting golden hues through the windows as the city unfolded around them. Abigail leaned against James, her small frame relaxing for the first time since the incident. The passengers had returned to their routines, though the mood on the bus remained lighter, tinged with a newfound sense of camaraderie. James glanced out the window, his mind replaying the events that had transpired. While his focus had been on protecting Abigail, the deeper implications of the moment weighed on him. As they neared their stop, an elderly woman sitting across from them caught James's attention. "I've seen too much hate in my life," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "It's good to see someone like you, someone who doesn't just fight back but teaches a lesson." James nodded, appreciating her words but knowing the battle against ignorance was far from over. "Thank you," he replied. "We all have a role to play in making things better." Abigail, ever curious, looked up at her grandson. "James, why do some people hate others for no reason?" she asked, her voice filled with the innocence of a wise elder trying to make sense of the world. James hesitated, searching for the right words. "Sometimes people hurt others because they're hurting inside," he explained, "but it doesn't make it right. That's why it's important to stand up and show them a better way." Abigail nodded thoughtfully, her experienced mind grappling with the complexity of the answer. When the bus finally came to their stop, James and Abigail rose, the other passengers offering them warm smiles and nods of respect as they stepped off. James felt a sense of pride, not just in how he had handled the situation, but in the way his grandmother had shown courage and forgiveness. The two walked home hand in hand, the setting sun casting long shadows behind them. James knew the world wasn't perfect, but in moments like this, he was reminded of the power of resilience, love, and the unyielding bond between a grandson and grandmother. The walk home was quiet, the cool evening air wrapping around James and Abigail like a calming embrace. They passed rows of houses and small shops, their footsteps steady against the rhythmic backdrop of a city winding down for the day. Abigail, her small hands still clasped in her grandson's, broke the silence. "James, will we ever see that man again?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and concern. James thought carefully before answering, his gaze fixed ahead. "I don't know, Grandma," he admitted, But what's important is that we did the right thing today. Sometimes we may never know if our actions change someone, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. Abigail seemed to absorb the words, her thoughtful mind turning over the lessons from the day. I hope he changes, she said softly. I don't want him to hurt anyone else. As they approached their house, the warm glow of porch lights greeted them. James knelt to Abigail's level, placing both hands on his grandmother's small shoulders. You were incredibly brave today, he said, his voice filled with pride. Not just for standing strong, but for forgiving someone who hurt you. That takes real strength. Abigail smiled, a mix of relief and pride lighting up her face. I learned it from you, James, she said. James's heart swelled at the words, a reminder of the weight and privilege of being a protector. Inside their home, the familiar smells of dinner filled the air, grounding them after the tumultuous events of the day. As they sat at the kitchen table, James encouraged Abigail to talk about her feelings. Knowing the importance of processing such an intense experience, Abigail listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and sharing her thoughts. By the end of their conversation, James could see a spark of resilience in his grandmother, a sign that she was growing not just in years but in character. That night, as Abigail drifted off to sleep, James sat by her bedside, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. He thought about the challenges that lay ahead, not just for Abigail, but for the world they lived in. Yet in moments like these, he felt a profound sense of hope. The seeds of kindness and resilience they had planted today, he knew, would grow into something stronger tomorrow. And with that thought, James rose, kissed his grandmother's forehead, and turned off the light, ready to face whatever came next with the same unwavering strength and love.